That is incorrect already. Let me fix that.
Not live on
Lesson
Twitch.
3. I am live on Twitch. It just might take a little bit to come up live for you. But we are live on Twitch. But lesson 3, Introduction to CSS, is what this is supposed to be, not JavaScript. JavaScript is for the next one. Or maybe we'll get into JavaScript today. We'll see. But alright, so before we kind of go into a lot of detail about CSS, I want to do a quick recap about what we talked about on the last lesson. And that was all HTML. But so first and foremost, some of you guys had some issues with like some NetBeans settings and with indentation. I don't know what happened to what I had open there, but let me open a file here. And I'm just gonna open one of the files you guys sent me as an example, and I think for the sake of keeping it PG, I'll go with Nora's, and we will look at. So one thing first, if like when you get a chance, if you're using NetBeans, these are like the recommended settings for tabs and spaces, so that we can all kind of stay consistent with each other, since we're kind of like working as a team here. You want to go to Tools, Options in your NetBeans, and then there you want to go to Editor, and then you want to go to Formatting, and then you want to switch to all languages and make sure that you have indentation enabled. Make sure that your number of spaces per indentation is 4, tab size is 4, right margin doesn't matter, but I have mine as 80. The right margin is just like this blue line on the center of your screen. And line wrap off. Okay, so this is just going to make sure that when you're using tabs to indent, everything is kind of flowing properly, and then it's kind of making sense with the amount of spaces that you have. Hope that sure.
I'll post a screenshot in discussion.
Okay, that works. Thank you. All right, so now I want to break down a little bit of just a very quick recap on what we were talking about on the last session about HTML, and I want to make sure that this really hits home and makes sense. And I just realized I was in the wrong Twitch template, so Twitch didn't see the settings, so I'll pull it up one more time just to have it in the video for the future very quickly. So you want to go to Tools, Options, Editor, and then you want to go to Formatting. Make sure you are on all languages, and then just make sure these settings are the same. Number of spaces per indent 4, tab size 4, right margin 80, line wrap off, enable indentation on. That's it. If you want the same colors that I use, I can send you my color file, but the theme that I use is an appearance, look and feel flat LAF, dark, however you pronounce that, flat laugh, whatever. You could pick whatever style you want. How it looks is irrelevant. That is all up to you. That's personal preference. So, okay, so HTML was really dealing with a lot of angle brackets. So the breakdown for elements. This is one I want to make sure is extremely clear to everybody as we move on to CSS. So we're going to just kind of do a quick recap again. So within your anchor tags, you have your HTML element. That's always going to be the first word that's next to the open anchor bracket. And then you have, I have to like switch my thing to stream mode so it stops making all those Discord noises while I'll do that for next time. And then you have your attributes. Now, very quickly, I was rewatching the video from the last lesson, and I noticed I caught myself calling it a property a lot, and that's my bad. I tried my best to always call it an attribute. It's difficult because in a lot of languages it's technically a property, but in HTML it's called an attribute. So if that confused you, then I apologize. But if you hear me say HTML property, HTML attribute, I'm talking about the same thing. So like in this case, it's source, right? So source is an attribute. Coding.jpg is the value of the source attribute. I think everybody gets this, but I just want to make sure that this is clear, because this is the same for every single HTML element, period. And then just to kind of one more time go over it again. So in the body, if I was describing my students, which is all of you in this list, I'm going to stop start looking at from bottom down. So brass, right? Let's just say that brass is an HTML element. So this is brass, and like style of brass could be like hair. I actually don't remember what color his hair is, so I'm just gonna say long. Brass has long hair. Gender, brass is a male. So I'll just stick to those two, right? So this is brass as an HTML element, and then the next one on the list is Jonathan. So Jonathan is the name. Hair, I remember John telling me he has long hair, but from the pictures that I see, I think it's short hair now. I could be wrong, but I'm gonna say short hair. Correct me if I'm wrong. Gender male, right? So this is the HTML element. This is the attributes. This is the value of the attributes. I just want to make sure that all makes sense. And then we have. I actually am gonna go through it. I know this is kind of stupid and tedious, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Next one on the list is Nora. Hair. I'm assuming long. Pretty sure. And then gender female, and then scopes. Oh, so many jokes come to my head, but let's keep it professional. Hair short, gender male.
Nobody knows.
All right.
Female.
And okay, so HTML and attributes. Now, hopefully that makes sense. My IDE is like I don't know what the hell these elements are, so it's like doesn't like it, but you know. So that's HTML elements on a nutshell. Everything you see from top to bottom of an HTML file is going to comprise of element, attributes, values. As long as that makes sense, we can move on. Now, when you're writing anything, and this is going to apply to CSS, it's going to apply to JavaScript, so I am going to go over it. I'm going to start with HTML, and this is going to be a good segue to kind of start getting into the JavaScript code. And this is how should you go about writing your code, like, you know, when you're kind of like writing it like a book. And this is just something that I took notes on because I realized, like, watching you guys practice stuff in between last session and this session, your IDE tries to do a lot of work for you. Depending on IDE, some of them might do more than others. Typically, this is not a bad thing. It could be annoying if you don't like it. Like, I've turned off a lot of code completion before. That's what it's called. Like when you're writing something and your IDE is like writing something automatically, right? That's called code completion. If you don't like code completion, you can go to Tools, Options, Editor, Code Completion, and then just uncheck the stuff that you don't like for whatever language you're coding on. I'm not going to go over what they are. You can kind of figure that out on your own. That's all personal preference. But so when I write HTML, I open an HTML tag, right? Now here's like how you should think about these things as a programmer. You just open an HTML tag. Your mind is already like, okay, so what's going into my HTML? Don't try to remember that you have an open HTML tag so that you can tell yourself to remember that you got to go and close it later. Just close it first. And IDEs will sometimes do that for you. Just close it already. Now you don't have to worry about going back and closing it. It's already closed, and then you're coding inside of it. That saves you from making a lot of mistakes. And there's like a couple things that I saw when you guys were practicing. So like, for instance, if you are gonna put, so you got your HTML head. I'm gonna do a head tag. Same thing. Open your head tag, close your head tag. You don't need to try to remember that you have an open head tag, because then you're gonna open something else, then you're gonna open something else. You don't want to have to keep track in your head of all the things you need to remember to close, because especially with JavaScript, you're going to waste a lot of time trying to figure out what did you forget to close, and kind of going through your code trying to figure out what's wrong, right? And then you open your body, close your body already. Now let's get into the actual tag. So if I'm doing a P here, right? I started the P, close the P already, close it before you do anything. Now if you want to actually add, so this is a paragraph, right? I'm just gonna write whatever, paragraph. And if you are going to give it an attribute, like say I'm going to give this an ID, you do ID equals open, close your quotes. Like again, my ID does this automatically. There's nothing wrong with that. So my ID is going to be, I don't know, I'll call it lemon. So this is my paragraph ID. I'm going to make another paragraph. I'm going to give it a class. Make sure that your open double quote, close double quote is already open and closed before you start typing. If you follow that like pattern for writing code, you're never going to encounter a situation where this happens and then you continue on your code just writing other things and notice that this is open. Your code thinks, like, if I'm going to write an anchor tag here, test.html, test, whatever, you just kind of kept writing your thing. Now, first of all, your IDE is very confused. Your indentations are not working properly because it thinks that everything that you just wrote is inside of this class. Because if I close this, technically now, this is all, actually no, that's wrong. It thinks that everything from this first double quote to this double quote here is inside of this class. You understand? So let me kind of put it all on the same line so it makes sense. Because I forgot to close this here, it thinks that this is where it's closed. From here to here. And then over here is where you would begin a new element, and so on, right? Obviously, you can prevent making mistakes like that by adapting this pattern of always closing everything before you start writing inside of it. Very basic instruction. Try to keep that in mind with everything that you do. If that becomes muscle memory, then you'll save a lot of time in the long run. Trust me, I learned it the hard way. So hopefully you guys don't have to also learn it the hard way. But that's just one of those things. Okay, so what's next on my list? Okay, so one thing that I had on the HTML list that I kind of forgot to talk about is, which I think you guys are already doing a pretty good job at it already anyway, is a big thing that I want to be able to teach you guys how to do is how to teach yourselves. And that's one of the reasons why I try to teach fundamentals more importantly, instead of telling you guys all the different things you can do and giving you a whole bunch of examples of different elements, because once you understand the structure of an element, you can make it work with whatever element you choose. And I don't think we need to talk much more about that. So let's talk a little bit about the HTML style property, right? Let me go ahead and just leave this paragraph as a normal paragraph. I'll leave this anchor tag as a normal anchor tag. Let's save. Okay, and then here's another pro tip. If you are somebody who wants the ability to see side by side what you're changing as you go, you can just change your IDE to not be full screen and open up your browser window on the other side, if you don't have an IDE that does this for you, and you can basically open your file here. Let me actually open my file. So I think it's notepad.html. Oh, I put Discord there by mistake. Whoops. Let me move Discord out of there. Let me open my file with Chrome. Open with Chrome. And this is my test. And for now, because this is on Twitch and it's a whole big screen with a lot of small text, I'm not gonna do this for this lesson. I don't want to have too much stuff on the screen. I don't want to confuse anybody. I'll keep it all full screen so I can talk about it individually, and I'll switch to the examples. But if you want to code and test things at the same time, you make your change here, you refresh that, you get to test it. You don't want, if you have an IDE that wants to be a browser, that's cool and all, but I don't recommend it. Anyway, moving on. So all right, so CSS. So we're gonna start with the style tags that you guys are already familiar with, right? And this is when we want to talk about the fundamentals of CSS. Let me go ahead and maximize that, and let me maximize that. So the fundamentals of CSS are actually very, very basic. Just like HTML, the CSS, you're going to point to what you're trying to style. If you do not have a prefix, and a prefix is what goes before the name you're giving. Like in an example, you can do a hashtag for IDs, you can do a dot for class. There's all kinds of different prefixes for other things you can do, like a hover state, or we're not going to get into that too much right now. But if you're writing P, right, and you're opening and closing squiggly bracket or curly bracket, this is what the brackets that you use for CSS. And it's the same thing that I just talked about before. If you're opening your curly bracket, close it right away, and then you set up your indentation right away. So you're gonna start writing your code for your P tags here. So if I'm gonna give it I'm just gonna give it a padding of 10 10 pixels. Padding is the space that goes around it. Internally, padding is internal space. Margin is external space. I'll explain that a little later in a better example. I'm gonna give this a background color of, I don't know, let's go with aqua, whatever what IDE is suggesting here, and it says this is a paragraph. So if I save this now and I refresh, there's my paragraph. Right now, because this is just a p tag and I didn't actually give it like an ID, a class, or anything like that, I'm gonna copy and paste this paragraph a bunch of times.
I'm gonna do it to all of them.
And it's going to correct. This is going to affect, and you guys are already ahead of the curve here because you guys already started tampering in CSS way before this lesson, and that's actually very good. That it affects everything, you know. So it's important to know how to determine. Now, what if you wanted to only affect some of these paragraphs and not all of them, right? So let's talk about, first of all, let's talk about ID. If we wanted to just, now this is all ID lemon, right? This is obviously, you don't ever want to give the same ID to multiple things. Although in CSS it'll technically work, it'll recognize, so I'm just targeting ID lemon, right? It'll recognize that all of these things have ID lemons. In JavaScript, it's not quite going to work like that. It's going to find the first one and that's it. So do not give more than one thing the same ID. ID should be unique, you know. So if you're giving an element an ID, nothing else in your whole entire document should have that ID. So we're going to use fruit since we started with lemon. This one's going to be orange, and this one's going to be apple, and this one's going to be cherry. Okay, and we're going to try to actually style these a little bit like the fruit. I'll actually just use 4. I don't need all the other ones, right? So lemon, I'm going to give it background color green. Okay. So now we have a green lemon, and everything else is unstyled because I'm targeting it by ID. Now, I know that with some of you guys on the last lesson, I think I showed a table example where I did like table ID. So the way it works is you can have like P, which styles everything, and you can say P lemon, right? And that will only style that one tag, and it's a P tag. Now, what if I had a div, okay, and I'm going to move my div down here. I'm gonna call, and this is a div, not a paragraph tag, and I want to call this div like I don't know, let's call it apple. Well, actually no, I already have apple, sour grape, whatever. Or yeah, I'm just gonna say grapes. It doesn't matter. Okay, so this is just grape. This is a grape, and now I have all these classes here for all these things. I'm gonna actually remove all these classes for now, just to kind of keep things simple.
Lemons are yellow, by the way, not green.
Limes are green. Okay, you know what? Sure, lime. There we go. It's a lime now. Lime, background color green. Thank you for that. You know, so right now, like this is still targeting only this. Now, how would you target more than one thing at the same time? You would use class instead of ID, right? So let's just say I want to make another div here, and I want to give it a class of lime as well. And then I want this paragraph to also be class lime. Well, first of all, this P hashtag lime or pound sign lime, the ID operator here for lime is not going to work because there's no longer an ID lime. They're both class lime. Okay, now class and ID are kind of like the same in CSS, as in you can reference them with an operator, but instead of a instead of a pound sign or a hashtag sign for class, you're going to use a dot. So dot is the class representative. It'd be useful to have like some kind of chart, right? So I'm going to add some HTML notes here. And by the way, is the size of the font good enough here, or should I make this a little bigger?
No, it's good. I can read it.
Okay, good. All right, so pound sign for ID, dot for class. Okay, it's important to note the difference. It takes a little bit to get used to it. It's going to take a lot of trial and error to get used to the difference. But it's dot for class, hashtag for ID. So now I'm saying p.line because it is a paragraph with the class of lime. it'll go ahead and only target my paragraph up top. But what if I wanted to target the div as well? I can copy and paste this and make it div, but if I don't specify an element and I just say .lime, now this is affecting anything at all that has the class of lime, regardless of what type of element it is. It could be a div, it could be an anchor tag, it could be a table. They all have class lime. I'm not telling it like a specific element, so now it's actually going to go and grab that other class as well. You know, so you get the idea, right? So a class is something that you can use to style multiple things at the same time. Let me remove these other classes over here. Where an ID, an ID is when you want to target one individual element. So that's kind of talking about CSS targeting. Now let's make this a little more complicated. Now what if I have a div called fruits? I'm going to div ID fruits, right? And all of these fruits are inside of my div fruits. Okay, so this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about how you nest things with CSS. So because right now it's class lime and there's no like prefix to it, there's nothing before it, it's still going to work the same, right? It doesn't make a difference. But if I wanted to say, I'm going to now, just for the sake of example, I'm going to make another P above this one. I'm going to call it class lime again. So P class lime. This is actually, I'm going to just copy and paste the same one, right? So I have the same one. And again, I haven't changed anything. So now we have 3 of them that are styled like this. What if I only want to style the ones that are inside of my div called fruits? And the way you would do it is you use space as a separator. So I can do fruits, fruits. It will help if I knew how to spell, space, class lime. So what this is doing is saying target fruits, and then everything that's inside of, because there's a space, now it's only looking within fruits. So everything that has a class lime that's inside of fruits should get that green color. And there we go. So it ignored that lime now because I told it to only look inside of fruits, right?
Please make it lime green.
I know that this is confusing. What was that? What was that? Did you say?
Said, please make it lime green.
Lime green? I don't.
Yeah, please. Oh God.
Sure. Okay, no problem.
This is
lime
actually
green.
Serious stone.
But okay, so now you understand how you target something that's inside of something, right? You separate it by spaces. As far as fundamentals for CSS goes, that's kind of it. That's kind of all there is to it. Like, you know, as far as like targeting goes, this is how you target elements. If they're nested inside of things, you use spaces to separate. I can get into more complex examples and do a div inside a div inside a div inside a div.
You already have 2 divs in that div, so.
Well, okay, yeah. So like for instance, if I wanted class line, well, yeah. So you get the point. You know, there is no limit to this. You can have a bunch of nested IDs that are inside of another class and that's inside of another ID, and so on and so forth. If you want to target something very, very specifically with CSS, that is how you would target it, just like that. So this is called a selector. I'll put it here on my and what this is here, the double. So this for JavaScript and for CSS, if you want to put an inline comment, which means the code ignores it. So that's kind of like how you take notes within your code. And I'm gonna say, I forgot what the note I was gonna put was. Okay, so yeah, this is called a CSS selector. Okay, and what the selector means is basically how you target your HTML elements. So you can target literally any HTML element based on this iterator. Again, remembering that without the ID or the class prefix, if you're typing just the name of that, then this will target every single div. And if I give all of the divs on this document a background color of red, you're gonna not get anything because all the divs that we have class line or ID gray. Actually, that's incorrect. Hold on, something's wrong here. It's because I wrote color wrong. There we go. So no, it's still not doing anything. I have something else that's wrong. That's embarrassing. Hold on a second. So this div ID grape should get this background color red. Why it's not doing it right now, I'm not sure. Is it because
You didn't reference the div ID.
well, I'm targeting div as an element, so it should actually go for every single div in this document regardless. There we go. I think it's okay. So I lied. Double forward slash is not for CSS. This is just for JavaScript. I mean, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's just for JavaScript. For CSS, you need this. Oh God. So slash asterisk to open a comment, and then asterisk close the slash to close a comment. That's how you write comments in CSS. This is how you write comments in HTML. It's confusing. I think I'll have a different day to talk about comments. It's not really important right now, you know, but just so you guys know what you're looking at in HTML, if you want to do an inline comment, you do open tag exclamation dash dash. That's how you start your comment.
Oh, trust me, I know.
Then you do double dash close anchor tag, and there's your inline comment in HTML. If you're in CSS, you need forward slash asterisk to start your comment, and then asterisk forward slash to close your comment. Now, back to what I was talking about. So this div is actually targeting every single div. So if we go through the document, it's making all of the fruits have a background red, and then it's making each individual ID inside of it, because like it's literally going to apply this to every single individual div that it finds. It's giving it red. Now, because this code is underneath and it's a little more targeted, it's going to override the background for the divs that have the class of lime inside of fruits to lime green. So this one, well, no, not this one, because this is this is not a div. But so this div is the only one that will override that red, right? Which is this last one here. Does that make sense? I know I made this super confusing, but that's why I want to make sure from everybody. Does that confuse anybody? Do I need to explain this a little better to anyone? Okay. I'll take silence as a no, and we can move on. So let me look at my CSS notes. ID, making elements look. Okay. So one thing that's kind of important to understand about how browsers handle elements. Now, by default, you have like divs and paragraphs and all these things that we have here. They're all, I'm gonna get rid of this just to keep things a little more simple. They kind of all have their like built-in style that your browser acknowledges. So for example, every single paragraph and every single div, although you don't see it here, right? So I guess now user agent style sheet, that's new. I don't remember this last time I looked. But so this is the default styling that Chrome uses for your paragraphs. And then if you click on a div, this is the default styling that it uses for a div, right? So if you notice, this display is the same. The only thing that changes for a div, for a paragraph, is it has all these margin blocks and margin inlines or whatever, right? It's just kind of creating some extra margin. And you can kind of see it. The paragraphs have a little indentation here before your text starts, where the divs don't, right? So that's just a margin. You can overwrite that. You can go and say margin. Well, let me actually go into our style here. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to do it here. I'm sorry. So let's take this paragraph that has this little margin. If I didn't want this thing to have a margin, I can just go here and say margin 0. Now I'm removing like all the margins from it. You know, and if I want to override this margin block start, I can say margin block start 0. And that overrides that. You know, I'm selecting that paragraph. But that's how you would override all those default styles. You see it put a asterisk over it because it's no longer using the default browser style. It's using the new style that you applied to that element. So with that said, let's focus on display. Display block basically means that once it's done, it'll take up a display block means that it'll take up 100% of the available width that it has, and it'll create a line break in between. So if I turn all of these, let's just say I made all of these elements, I'm gonna go ahead and I'll just actually as you do the line class ones. I'm gonna take these two elements and I'm gonna make them width 200 pixels, right? Like that. So now, if we inspect it, you notice that these end over here, but it's still taking up the full space of our web page, just like everything else, and that's because of the display. So if you change the display from block to, I don't know, like display inline block will pretty much treat this kind of like a normal span or a normal text or an image where it can go next to each other. Now the reason why everything still looks the same is because although this can have something next to it now, this can't and this can't. So it's gonna kind of put them in between. But now if I style every single div, if I just add like a new, actually let's do it over here, right, and make it a little simpler. If I style every single div on this document like we did before, and actually we're going to do the same thing with paragraph. And here's something that I forgot to mention with CSS, and I apologize. You can separate different styles, and you can, like, if you want to share the same style for multiple things, you can use comma separation to do that as well. And it could be nested, like we could have a nested fruits, and then you can have like a whole different div that's called vegetables, and you can do that, and it's the same thing. Like, it doesn't really matter like how you nest it. The comma is just like a whole different selector, if you will. Hope that makes sense. So moving on here, if I want to make all of this have width 200px and change it to display inline block instead, now all of these elements are gonna kind of like come next to each other. There's something not all of them did. Let's look at this here. We have all of this. Oh, div fruits, and then okay. Yeah, so this is all now because all of these are inside of div fruits. That didn't really happen, and because div fruits is only 200 pixels, they only really just fit here, right? So if we take div fruits and we actually just give div fruits specifically a width of 100%, now, like, you know, everything inside of div fruits is all next to each other, and that's because we changed the way it displays. It's not displaying block where it needs the whole width of the page. It's displaying inline block where it kind of acts like a span would. A span is a whole different element, you know. So typically you can save yourself a lot of time by using, like, so say for instance you want a div, you want something that's going to span the whole width, right? Use a div. If you want something that's going to act more like this, use a span. You know, we didn't talk about span, but this is what a span is, and it's basically kind of like a p tag, but it has an inline block style. Actually, I'll just show you like what the Chrome different styling is for a span. Okay, so this is a span. Notice the span here. Notice I didn't have to actually do any specific styling to it. By default, this doesn't have that display block, so it'll just kind of act like normal text. And a span is a good thing to use if you want to like change the color or the style of a font, like you want to make it like, for example. So now let me take a step back. HTML, you can do things, and I saw you guys do some things like using strong or using like, so you can use strong to make something bold, right? And I've seen, like, I don't know if you guys use font size. So these are HTML styling tags that you should not ever use. You should not use HTML to style your text. It's bad practice. I mean, like, it's not the end of the world, like, if you do it, but you want to try to always style everything with CSS. So if I have a text inside of a span and I want to make it bold, don't wrap it in strong tags. Just make a class for your span, or, like, you know, just make sure that your CSS selector can target whatever it is that you're trying to style, right? And then you can use font weight bold. You know, learn what the CSS styles are to style your text. Like, you know, and if you want to change the font size, you know, you can change. I'll leave it as 120. It's gonna be huge. You can style it like that, right? And if you want to change the color,
so doing it in the style tag is okay. Doing it in the line is not okay, with like the B's and the EM.
Yes, like, so avoid using HTML style because it's just old, it's outdated, it's clunky, and it just makes it like it just makes it extra messy where you like just think styling CSS. If it's styling, just keep it all CSS. The only things like, so we're always going to have either an ID or a class to identify our elements, and then we can use CSS always to target those elements and do whatever we want to them. And then, like for instance, if you want to make it italic too, like, you know, you could, it's font style oblique. This is the most confusing one that took me a long time to memorize when I was learning, because I don't even know why it's called oblique, but that's how you make things italic, you know. And then if you wanted to use this, the HTML styling for that, it would be as simple as just like wrapping it with an I, right? Which probably feels easier than going over there and typing font style oblique, but the font style oblique is the appropriate good practice way of doing this, you know. But the main thing that I wanted to get out of this here is, like with this quick example that I was showing you guys, is that you can style anything to look like anything. And I'll wrap that with one final example, right? So like we have this link here on the bottom, and it says this is a test. Now, one thing that I probably didn't mention about an anchor tag, you can put anything inside of an anchor tag. If I wanted to wrap this anchor tag around this whole entire document and make it so the whole entire page is clickable and goes somewhere, you could do that. But you know, it's not very common to see anchor tags used that way. Anchor tags are usually just used for like making one piece of text go somewhere, right? And I'm going to talk about hover states and all that stuff in a second. But the first thing I want to do is the difference between a button and an href. So this is a button, and then this is an anchor tag. This is an anchor tag. And yeah, we will definitely not get into JavaScript today, as I realize the time. But let me add a line break between the two. Keep it lowercase. So now we have our button and our anchor tag. Now, what if I wanted to make this button look exactly like this anchor tag? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. All I would have to do is style my button to, first of all, not have any padding, not have any margins, not have background color. And I'm getting there. You know, it still has that little button style, but you can literally go and you can say, okay, I don't want a border. And I don't remember off the top of my head like what the other styles are that are causing that. I could cheat and look over here and see, okay, so there's all this other bullshit. And again, buttons look different in different browsers, right? A button will look different in a different browser. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that go into how browsers style a button. Like a button in it's like without any styling at all, a button in Firefox or Edge or whatever will look different than a button in Chrome. You know, without any style.
Oh yeah, because it says border style outset. I see it.
Yeah. Like so, there's a lot. Like if I were to basically get rid of all of this, it'll look exactly like that. I'm not gonna do it. I just take my word for it. It'll look exactly like this one, except it's not gonna have the blue overlay in the underline. It's just gonna be a text, right? Because I remove all the style from it. I'm removing all the style from the button. And then the same thing with the anchor tag. If you look at the anchor tag, it has its default style, which has this whole color web link, which is blue, and then cursor pointer, which means when you hover over it, you get that little mouse button. Notice that this button doesn't have that. If I want the button to have that, I just gotta say cursor pointer. And now when I go and look at my, when I hover over my button, now I also have, wait, is it, did I do it wrong? Cursor pointer. Cursor pointer. Okay, there we go. I had a colon instead of semicolon. And there's my pointer there, right? So you can like make, so basically, as you can see, you know, it's all CSS styles. Everything visually is all controlled by CSS styles, and anything can basically look like anything. But you have default ways that things look and act, which some are actually the same across all browsers, others aren't. Like for instance, you know, with divs and the whole inline block versus normal block display that I was showing you guys, that's going to be the same for every single browser you look at in. Buttons are going to be slightly different, and we're going to talk about like Bootstrap framework in the future and like frameworks in general. But all you gotta kind of focus on for now is like how you can make the difference. Now, an anchor tag, you guys already know that if you have an href, clicking on it will go to that href. So let's talk about hover states. Hover states is basically how do you change the color of this only when you put the mouse over it. So that's called a state in CSS, or in a lot of other languages too, right? Why do I have anything here? So let's give this anchor tag here. Let's actually go ahead and style this anchor tag to look a little better. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so the color is I don't know, I'll go with like red, whatever. I'll make it bold. I'm gonna make it bigger. Font size 14 pixels. And I think, let's take a look at how that looks now. Right, so this is my anchor tag. So I don't want an underline. I don't like the underline. Let's say text decoration, none. Because text decoration is the underline style that it has. So I don't want an underline. Let me give it some padding, like some spacing around it, because it's too close to everything else. Let me give it like 10 pixels of padding. So now it's like, it's nice and padded, right? Let me also give it a margin. So it's like the external spacing is also kind of further away from everything else. So when you give it a margin, it kind of pushes everything away. Now this button is still really close. I can go ahead and give it like a width and a height. So let's give it a width of 10 pixels, a height of width of 200 pixels. Let's give it a height of whatever the font size is, 16 pixels. Okay, so now we have our, that didn't do shit, but that's fine, right? So now I want to make it so when I hover over this text, I want the underline to come up, and I want the color to change to like pink, right? That's terrible styling design, but you know, this is just for example. That's up to the users what you want to do. So how would you do that? Then you would do A, and then you do the hover state. States are always going to be followed by a colon, you know, and this is where it gets a little confusing. But so a hover basically means everything that I want to style for when you hover over that button. So I want to change the color to pink, and I want to make the text decoration underline. Oh my goodness, underline for that one. And there you go. Now you have a pink underline button when you hover over it. And you can do the same thing with the button. If I want to like give the button a hover style as well, it's going to be really ugly, but it's the same thing. You can give your button that hover style, same exact thing. You can do that for anything, not just anchor tags or buttons. It's obviously kind of weird to give something else a hover style if it's not a button.
Oh, it's so trolly though.
But you can do it. Like, you could pretty much do whatever you want with it. You know, and that's what hover states are for. Now let's talk about testing hover states on your development tools. There's actually some pretty nice features here that help you make it a little easier. You see there's Hov CLS element classes here. If you click on the hover state, it lets you see the different kind of states that you can code. So if I click on hover, it's going to basically show me everything as if it was hovered on. And then you can go and like play it, like so you can change whatever you want, and then go ahead and paste that change to your code if you're trying to like see what it's going to look like on your website first before you actually apply it to your code. You would use these states here to change, you know, how to change it to display the hover state so that you can then go and do whatever you want with it. Makes sense? I hope so. You know, and as far as CSS goes, that is basically, and I know you guys already did quite a bit already of experimenting with CSS. I'm looking at my notes here to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, so there's two more things I'll show you guys here. One of them is actually something that John had asked me about, so I'll talk about that a little bit. Let's use this anchor tag as an example for that. But first thing I'm going to talk about too is media queries. So a media query is going to look something like this. It's going to say media, and it's going to say max width 600 pixels. what the fuck does this mean? Actually, that's not correct. Let me look at the proper syntax for media query, because I don't even remember off the top of my head. Media query CSS. It looks like, let's see. Okay, I was close. I was close. So this goes in parentheses, and then you have your open and close tag, right? So this basically means the size of your screen. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. You guys can play with this if you want. But so this is basically going to change things if the size of your screen is like 600 pixels width, right? So if the width, so like say for instance, I'm looking at, so you can look at responsive designs. Let's look at btchu.com as an example. So this has some media queries so that as I change the size of my screen, things are kind of like shifting around and changing the style based on the size of my screen. The way you make this work is with media queries, and you can override anything. So like say any style that I put in here, like, so if I'm like doing fruits lime in here, right, then on a normal size screen this is going to be the style, and then inside my media query this is going to be the style. I know that right now they're the same, but if you're overriding the padding, then that changes only for that screen size. And if you're overriding the background color, then that changes only for that screen size, and so on. And as far as like what you want to do with that is really 100% up to you, you know. And but the idea that you kind of get out of this is media queries are used to make what's called responsive designs, where if you're looking at it on your phone, it's going to look a lot different than when you're looking at it on your web page. And to make it more user friendly, you want to style things slightly different depending on the size of the screen, so to make sure that everything kind of like presents properly for the user, right? And that's what media queries are used for. Other than media queries, so we're going to talk a little bit about CSS animations. Now, once upon a time, JavaScript was what you would use to animate anything. Things that are changing now for like the past, I want to say, 6 years or so, things all have moved to CSS animations. And the most basic way to animate something with CSS, I'm going to try my best to explain it in a way that it makes sense. And I actually, confession, I have only styled things with JavaScript up until URLC thing that I did, because I don't do a lot of browser animations in my like normal line of work. It's just not something that I mess with. So I did do a couple of animations for URLC, and we're actually going to go look at that just to make sure that I'm telling you guys how to do this properly. So it's going to be URLC overlays, app styles, and I'll just ignore what you're seeing here for a second. I just want to copy the transition style to make sure I got it correctly. Okay, so this is just the two things that I wanted to copy. All right, so there's two main properties for animating things in CSS. So, but before we start an animation, let's kind of like try to figure out what exactly we're going to be trying to animate, right? So let's animate the size of the font here. This huge, this is the span. That's what we're going to animate today. Now you can kind of think about this for just about anything you want to animate. Essentially all you're doing is, like, say I come here and I change the size to so the font size right now is 120. I change it down to 10. That's 100. That's not 10. 10, right? It's really small now. Now, it changed right before your eyes. You know, we changed the value, it just immediately changed. That's what you would expect. But if we decided to give this span a transition setting, so you're making it so transition, so its transition is the name of the CSS property they're going to use. Then you have to specify what property do you want to transition. In this case, it's font size, because that's what we want to transition. We want to transition font size. And then this is how long is your animation going to be. I'm just going to make it 3 seconds. Simple 3 second. Actually, let's make it, 3 seconds. 3 seconds animation. That's plenty. The transition timing function, you can play around with that. Like, because with this, I don't want to make this a whole animation. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on animation. This is a little bit about like the easing of the animation. And this is animation speak. Like, you could kind of look into easing functions and kind of learn a little bit about that. But you can really customize this to however you want the animation to kind of like start. Like, how much do you want it to move when it starts? How much you want it to go down? Linear is just like a straightforward, like, is the default, really. I really don't even have to have it here because it is the default function. But it's how it's going to go from point A to point B. It just smoothly goes in 3 seconds from point A to point B. So now that I have this transition style here, and I refresh this page, if I change the size now of this span, if I go ahead and change the font size to 10, notice how it slowly animates to that, right? It uses my transition of, it takes 3 seconds to go from the one it was before to the one that it just changed to. So 200. In a way, you're still using JavaScript for this because, you know, you will need to use JavaScript to tell it to change to whatever size you changed it to. But you don't have to use JavaScript to control like how it animates, how long the animation is going to be, and how you want the easing to be. All JavaScript is going to really be doing is what not JavaScript already does at its core, which is manipulate the HTML element to change whatever you want to change on the fly. So by changing something here in your development tools is equivalent to how it would happen if you changed it with JavaScript. So this is how you would animate something with CSS. And there's a different way of animating things with CSS. You can use CSS Animations, which are a little bit different, but I can't think of a lot of examples of when animation is better than transitions, honestly, off the top of my head. So transition animations is probably going to be the best deal for just about any animation you can imagine that you want to do. It's just a lot easier to work with. So that's how you would animate in CSS. And that's very advanced CSS because you guys shouldn't really be animating anything yet. But if you want to mess around with it and have some fun with it, it's that simple. Like, you know, it's basically you're just telling what kind of animation you want when you change that property, and then when you change it, it does it. And let's just use one final example, right? So we have this lime that's background green. Like, if we want to give a transition for a background color, so let's look at, where's that at? Fruits, limes, lime green. Let's give this transition as well. I'm going to keep it at 3 seconds, and I'm going to change it to background color. So now this is when this will only, like, so it'll affect when I change the background color to whatever color. So if I go here and I change the background color to red, it's going to slowly animate those background colors to red. And basically anything at all that you change that can be like transitioned from one value to another, numerical values, color values, etc., you can animate basically. Sizes. So in other words, you can animate pretty much anything. And that's how animations work in CSS. And we are getting close to the end of the hour. So let me just make sure that I did not miss anything. Okay, so there's one final thing that we need to talk about with CSS. And that's more about HTML organization than anything. So from the beginning, I talked a lot about keeping everything separate and keeping everything organized. And in programming, this is called separation of concerns. And it's very important for you to not have like a huge, enormous file that has everything. Because hypothetically, you can have an HTML file that has all your CSS and all your JavaScript and everything you're ever going to do in one file. And that just makes it very confusing, especially if you're working with a team. If you're working with a team, like say for instance, I need Brass to like make a quick update to something that's just style based, and I'm working on the index file. Now it sucks that we're both like doing something on the same file, so we got to make sure that when he makes his changes, he's not going to override my changes, and so on and so forth. If all he's doing is style and everything is nice and separate, then all he has to do is to just go and update that CSS file. So now we're going to talk about how do you put all of this styling into a different file. It's actually super basic. So here in the head tag, and it doesn't have to be in the head tag, but that's typically how it goes. You want the style to load before your page loads. You will use a link element. So link element, and then href is how you target a CSS file. So I'm going to call this style.css. That's going to be the name of my CSS file. It doesn't exist yet. And then you do need the rel style sheet for it to know that this is a style sheet for your web page. And you do need to tell it that it's type text CSS. So this is one of those things that it's good to have like a snippet of it. Like, you know, this is something that you want to like make once you put it in a project. This is one of those things that I personally never remember off the top of my head. When I know I need to apply a style, I'll just go and copy and paste it from somewhere else that I know I have it, just because I don't want to like forget any of these little details. But this is important and this is important, and then you changed your file name. So style.css is our file name, right? It doesn't exist right now. So, and I have all this style here. So now I'm gonna notice that this starts with a style tag, this ends with a style tag. Everything inside of this is CSS. So for my CSS file, I'm only gonna copy what's in between the style tag. I don't care about the tags themselves. The tags can go away. Now that I remove this, if I refresh my page, all the styling should be gone. Why is it not gone? I don't have a style.css here. Hold on a second. Oh, this is Norris. Oh my god. Oh, 1 second. I messed up. I touched the wrong file. I think originally I planned on actually doing all this stuff to Nora's file, and I ended up just going off of my example. Now it's a little too late. Anyway, so let's just paste that in here and remove. Let's copy our style here and then remove the style tag. Okay, bam, right? So all the styles are gone. I removed them, but this style.css doesn't exist. So there should be some error here telling me that it's trying to, you see, it's trying to find this file that doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and create that style.css file. You're gonna go to new. Well, this is in my desktop, I think, right? So yeah, just gonna go to new file, and I'm just gonna go to CSS other. I don't usually make the files like this, but hold on, let me see, where is it? Lemon test PHP. I don't want to make it on URLC actually. Hold on. Let me just for the sake of simplicity and not wasting anybody's time, I'm gonna make a CSS file right here because this is where my files are. I'm just gonna make a CSS file, style.css. Yep, and then I'm just gonna move it over here, and this is my CSS code. Now, because it's not inside of a style tag, I don't need this indented 3 spaces forward. I could actually have this all go in the beginning of my document, because this is a whole new CSS file now, and this is my style.css file, and it's in the same space as my notepad.html that links to it here, just like image links. I don't know if you guys remember that from the last lesson. As long as they're in the same place, you can just reference it directly, and then now it'll load my style. And now it's everything separate into a separate CSS file. And every time that you're working with CSS code, and this is going to be the same for JavaScript, you want to separate everything into a separate file so that it's nice and organized. So like, here's your HTML, here's your CSS. 2 completely separate things, and that's how it should be. 2 completely separate things. If, for instance, you want to organize this even further and have like a full, like say you have a whole bunch of CSS files, right? You don't want all these files to be mixed. You can make a folder called CSS, and you can put your style.css in that folder. And then how you, obviously this is not going to work now because it's not going to find the file anymore. So how do you target something that's in a folder? Very simple, just CSS/style.css. There you go. And now there's your style. And that's it. I'm not sure why that's happening like that, but it doesn't matter. I think it's because of the cache, but there is basically, so that's CSS in a nutshell. And like when you really break it down, like we're gonna kind of look at CSS the same way that we kind of break down HTML, right? And I think that's how I started, but it's a good time to, it's a good way to close this as well. Open the CSS file here. All CSS is, in the end of the day, it's going to be your selector or selectors if you have multiple ones separated by commas, and then you're going to have your open curly, and then inside each new line is going to be a property and a value. Property value is going to be property colon value semicolon, property colon value semicolon. And yes, you do need the semicolon in between each. If you only have one style, you don't need it. You know, but if you have multiple styles, you do need it, because it's not going to know where the first one ended. So even if you have just one, it's good to kind of get into the practice of just always having a semicolon. That just saves you from like forgetting to add it later. You know what I mean? And it's just a semicolon. It doesn't take up that much space. And then talking about like good practice and stuff like that. Again, you only need one indentation here, like one indentation like between each style and each property. You don't need extra spaces or extra lines in between properties. You only need one space after the colon. You do not need a space between like the property and the colon. Just do colon. Just do property colon directly. You know, and you don't need spaces between the semicolons either. Just keep it simple, keep it straightforward, and that is CSS. And I know that usually I always like break it up and ask you guys if you have questions throughout the process. I don't know if I did that this time. I apologize if there were questions.
You did.
Oh, I did? Okay, good. So now that we're kind of closing this off, does anybody have any CSS specific questions for me?
I don't know if it's CSS, but give me the definition of a span again.
It's not CSS, but since we did cover it on this lesson, that's fine. I'll go ahead and break it down. So think of a span kind of like a p tag, kind of like a div. The only difference is it's not going to create a new line for you automatically, right, by default. So like, you know how we were talking about how you don't want to style things out with HTML styles, like, you know, strong or B's or I's or whatever. So if you're, so like, just take this example here, like this is a paragraph. Like, let's pretend that we wanted to make the word paragraph like blue for whatever reason, right? If you did a div here, then it's going to if you did a div here, then it would actually go and like screw up your styling, because this div has its own styling. And we did do some stuff to divs here, I think. Yeah, we did. Like, we made it so it's all in display inline block. Let me get rid of this just to kind of give you a better example, right? So by default, a div will break your content into a new line. So all you wanted to do is change the color of that paragraph. You didn't want to like bring it into a new line. Same thing with if you do a paragraph instead of a div. If you do a paragraph, it's going to bring your paragraph down into a new line. So all you want to do is just like leave it the way it was, but you want to style that text. That's when people use span. So using a span doesn't change anything at all, other than the span animation that I did, because I'm targeting every span on the page, right? But that's how you would do it. And then you would give it like a span ID or a span class or whatever. Then you would target that with CSS and style it however you want to style it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it'd be like an individual structure in an element.
Yeah, a span doesn't have any browser specific styling. Like a span is just a very good way of like, I want to like give this my own styling. I don't want the browser to do anything for me. You wrap whatever you want to style in a span. Like, you don't want a new line. You don't want any of the other things that other items can do for you. Like, let's just very quickly to like look at a UL, right? So a UL is an unordered list, and every element of a UL is a LI. So like list item 1, you know, and this is your LI, and then let's just make like 3 of these. So list item 1, 2, and 3. This is what a UL looks like right here. You see this, right? There's a lot of styling that goes here, and instead of trying to describe it, I'll just show you. So every LI and every this is all like the browser styling. And again, different browsers, slightly different, but more or less the same thing. It has its own default thing. An OL is the same thing. It's just an ordered list instead of unordered list. So it's going to have numbers by default. It'll have 1, 2, 3. So if you're trying to make like a to-do list or a grocery shopping list or whatever, that's a good one to use, because then you don't have to worry about like remembering. Wow, I didn't even realize that this is all off and the browser's fixing it for me. But you don't have to remember like the order like in which you did things, right? Like, so say for example you accidentally forgot that this is supposed to be step 1, not step 7, then you don't have to worry about like changing the numbers. You just move it over to the first and it reorders it for you automatically. So that's what an ordered list will do. And there's a lot of things like that in HTML that just all it is, and it's very important to understand that all it is, all these things are, is just default styles, default CSS styles that the browser has. That's all that different HTML elements are. They're all essentially the same thing. They're just something that you can represent, you know, and you can put like content inside of, and you can nest them inside of each other. But by default, browsers will render them a certain way, you know. And then with CSS, you can manipulate that to do whatever you want, basically. But in the end of the day, it's all CSS.
Table.
Say that again?
A list, how you have the list inside the order list right now, is just a less complicated version of the table with the rows and headers?
Well, no, because a list is only going to go, like, it's one column down. Like, you don't, like, by default, you can't, like, really make, like, a list kind of, a table is more like columns and headers. Can you make columns and headers with an order list? Yes, you can. Like, you would have to go and just change the styling to make it, you know, so you get the point, right? You can manipulate the style of a UL or a OL and LI to make it, like, come out like a table. Like, if I make all these LIs have a certain width and give them all inline block, then they'll, like, nicely align and all that. But we're gonna, like, I'm kind of excited to get to when we start dealing with frameworks, because of how much frameworks do for you. It's gonna really kind of show you guys how easier this is. Like, but you can't really use frameworks unless you understand fundamentals, though. So we got to make sure we go through the fundamentals first. But yeah, any other questions? Anybody?
No, Stone, you've answered all my questions. Good job, bud.
Thank you. And again, like, you guys had already tampered with CSS before we got into this. And I think the only reason why this dragged longer than I wanted is because I wanted to cover some of the things that I forgot to cover on the last lesson. The last lesson was almost 2 hours, so it was good either way. Like, you know, and then the next one we get into JavaScript, which is really when it starts feeling more like programming. Because right now, I mean, not to say that this isn't programming. I hope you guys do feel like the stuff that you've been doing so far has felt like programming. But when we get into JavaScript, that's when you really get into, I guess, the word magic is used a lot. Because you get used to, like, you know, the sky is the limit. You can do anything, literally anything with JavaScript, like anything at all. Like, that's when you can manipulate this in all kinds of ways. But the reason why we covered HTML and CSS first is because once we get to JavaScript, one of the basic things that we'll be doing is using JavaScript to manipulate CSS and manipulate HTML with code. You know, so it's important to understand the CSS and the HTML first before we go into JavaScript. And JavaScript is next, and I'm excited about it. But since nobody has any questions, I will wrap up this stream right here. Have you already covered margin, borders, padding, and box in the center? Who is this? Reconcile? I don't know who this is. But
you got a new fan.
It's an interesting question. He asked that question like an hour ago. I didn't even notice. I wasn't paying attention to the chat, so I don't know if he's still here. He's probably not here. But as you guys know, I am not covering a list of every individual CSS property and what they do. That's like something that we'll kind of work on and figure out as we go. This is more for the sake of understanding the fundamentals and the syntax and how all of that works. My beard disappeared, man. I woke up this morning and it was gone. I don't know what happened. I'm just gonna have to wait for it to grow back now. But anyway, that wraps up this stream. Thank you guys very much for the time as always. I am excited about getting into JavaScript. I just realized the title of the stream is Introduction to JavaScript, which is incorrect, but it's okay. I'll fix it after it goes offline. What was that?
I thought you fixed it.
I fixed it on the on this screen over here, but I didn't fix it like on the title that's on Twitch at the moment. But that's okay. We'll it's not important. I can fix it afterwards and make sure it goes into YouTube with the right name. But okay, everybody, that wraps it up. Nobody has any questions. This is the same thing. Like, I always like to end this with practice suggestions. So if practice is just for CSS, this is like what I would say is like take the things that you guys already started messing around with, break that into its separate CSS file, and then maybe like look at anything that you styled like incorrectly with HTML, learn how to style that with pure CSS, and just go from there. And then just explore like different things you can do with CSS properties, which you guys have already been doing anyway. So just kind of keep from that, and that's it. So that closes
Learning the
this.
inline block like saved everything that I was having an issue with.
Oh, really? It's good.
Everything was trying to get everything like next to each other and centered right, but now inline block is gonna.
Yeah, inline block is very, very, very useful for sure. But everybody, this closes the stream. We'll discuss offline when we'll have the next one, and that's it. Thank you guys very much. End stream.